Okay, everybody, in this lecture, we're going to talk about both chapters 11 and 12, politics across borders as well as political violence. Now, if we go into chapter 11 and look at that, um, talks about kind of the relationship in politics going across borders. Diplomacy, trade, all of that stuff that we kind of expect to hear about. So we're going to talk about actions in the global arena. We're going to talk about realism and the theory that it has as we apply it to the subfield of international relations. We're going to talk about the theory of idealism, trying to explain how states act. We're going to talk about different types of international agreements, diplomacy, and define international regimes. Um, we're also going to look at some of these things really in detail, where we talk about globalization and the United Nations and a lot of these IGOs and NGOs, international government organizations, and non-governmental organizations, and how they act and react and deal with each other. So, you know, in San Diego, it's kind of easier for some of us to be able to take a look at kind of cooperations with the United States and other countries, especially with Mexico being so uh, close to us here in San Diego. There's cooperations on drug and gun reductions, kind of as a joint U.S. Mexican effort. Now, whether or not those cooperations are legitimate or not, that's for another kind of lecture to talk about it. But definitely, there are positive relations between the United States and Mexico. The UN involvement in Libya a few years ago is another example. Multinational corporations such as Toyota and things like Greenpeace, these NGOs deal with each other. These are non-governmental organizations. And we need to understand how these kinds of political behavior institutions function across borders, because diplomacy is very important, and foreign policy is one of the things that is really kind of scrutinized when people look at the abilities of a president or even a Congress. Remember, the president and his administration is responsible for detailing out foreign policy, and that's where we make a decision on how to act to other countries, simple as that. Whether it's on drugs, trade, immigration. And, a lot of these stem from a subfield of political science called international relations. And if you're interested in that, I know National teaches an international relations class. Generally, that's not my area of expertise. I've taught it a couple of times. It's a very good class. But if you're interested, that's an option. All right. So, why world trade? We hear about the WTO and some of the things that evolved out of the World Trade Organization, and there is it's a relatively new organization that started in 1995, and it regulates and facilitates international trade between governments, using a certain type of rules and regulations so trade can flow freely, um, you know, uh, eliminate all barriers to trade, such as a tariff, which is a tax on imports, subsidies, and selling goods abroad, costs to cripple competition. Um, this is kind of where we're starting to look at a little bit of globalization coming out. And back in the 90s, there was a pretty bad riot up in Seattle when the WTO was meeting, and I'll post a video that you could watch on that. It's not going to be required; it's more an FYI, and also kind of to settle trade disputes between countries. Defenders say that the WTO in both developed and developing countries enjoy kind of the profusion of less expensive and high quality imported products. I think we could, maybe categorize the United States as a beneficiary of some of these trades, um, especially when we expect, cheap commerce to come into the U.S. so we don't have to pay a lot for it, whether it be clothing, shoes, a car, or whatever. And kind of there's a belief that a lot of these kind of policies against the global economy would harm countries, and as a result, it opens up new markets to their firms, and it opens up ways that developing countries might be able to establish trade relations with other countries. Now, critics are going to say that the WTO primarily benefits the financial elites and multinational corporations like Sony. Disney is one. Greenpeace, just right off the top of my head, trying to think them out. And then even, it kind of also undermines the sovereignty of governments. Remember, we talked about sovereignty earlier in the term where sovereignty is based off of, a delineated border with a recognized government. A lot of people say that WTO, since you have to abide by the regulations, it's going to undermine the sovereignty of countries. When you think about it, it does make kind of sense. And there's definitely going to be inequality in wealth, both across countries and also within countries. And this has been kind of proven since the WTO began. I think the author uses the word regime a little bit recklessly here. I wouldn't necessarily classify it as a regime. I think regime is a little bit more of a pejorative term. It's is what it is. So when we talk about some of the goals of a country, we in a government, we've talked about this: prosperity, security, and stability. What do we need to be successful? I think, if we really start out at the beginning, I think you need security before you can achieve prosperity and stability. So that'd be my own personal opinion. But these can all be influenced by politics across borders, whether it's economic, security. Definitely security is a big one, right? And, the stability of government. If the global economy crashes, that's going to affect multiple countries, as we saw in the mid to late 2000s. So what motivates two states? Remember, we're going to use the term state and government interchangeably here. There's a couple of theories that are presented with this. Sorry about that. Sorry, I had to sneeze. Haven't had that happen before. Okay, political realism is a theory out of international relations that assumes that people are naturally disposed to base their behavior on self-interest. Idealism looks at you believe that people are basically good, kind of that Jean-Jacques Rousseau focus on the state of nature, and people and the states they construct are altruistic and cooperative, and I think that is a little bit ideal, right? I don't know if you could totally trust every country to act for the collective good. International political institutions can promote cooperative relationships among states, a positive sum game, and how it benefits each other. What is your orientation? What do you think? I think I would fall more into realism situation, but it's more of a rhetorical question. So think about it. Would you practice realism versus idealism? What would you rather have in place? I think kind of the house on the hill belief. It would be the political idealism, but I'm not quite sure people are naturally wired for that. When we talk about realism, there's some assumptions that are going to come out of that, and it's kind of a Lockean type belief when you look at it, a John Locke belief, where you think people are naturally disposed to behave selfishly. States are going to be in constant competition for power, right? Military power is usually decisive in the relationships among states. So generally, who has the biggest military is going to be successful. A state security is going to depend on its power resources. Sometimes some governments are going to act unethically, which we could obviously, look back at history and point to examples of this. And there's no really a supreme authority that protects the states from destructive behavior by other states in the international system. Therefore, they must ensure their own security. States can make treaties or break them, make war or cooperate with other countries for only one reason, to maximize its security goals. And I think the United States has done this in the past. There's some other perspective, constructionism, where actors develop unique understandings of events based on their knowledge, experience, and habits, kind of that learning through maybe failure types issues or even successes, right? And we have socially constructed identities, which are natures of identities and norms that shape beliefs and guide actions of individual groups and states in the international system. We also have some feminist IR, kind of uses feminist theory and gender studies as a reference, a frame of reference. And, it kind of goes into the fact that there's a belief that women act differently based off of a brain biology. I'm not really going to go into that because, to be honest, I really have no way of proving whether that's true or not true. So I'm not quite sure I can really advocate for it because, I mean, it's really a difficult subject to kind of put my brain around. And kind of out of that biology that the author talks about, that Danziger talks about, they're more inclined to cooperate, interactions, and nonviolent solutions. So I'm not quite sure the brain biology really has much of an effect on that, other than maybe your environmental situations, your environmental actors that might influence. I think influence is a little bit more observable than talking about somebody's brain makeup. I mean, that's just some part that I can't really wrap my brain around too much. We also have a geopolitical perspective that comes out of this chapter, and this assumes that the geography of each state, its physical characteristics, natural resources, human resource, might have significantly affect both the internal and external politics of state, like, having a heavily populated country, natural boundaries. And if we look at, when we go into chapter 12, we're going to talk about how at times territory boundaries will create war or violence between countries. And that's kind of been the tradition. And the importance of offshore waters to navigate, examples, Cuba and Taiwan. There's a really big concern ever since the 60s with Cuba. Actually, even before that, that Cuba is only 90 miles away from the United States, and that if Cuba had some type of communist influence in that region, the other countries, kind of that domino theory, that the other countries around it will fall to communism as well. So there's been issues about, especially in the 60s, about territory and embargoes and blockades that led to some of the issues with Cuba. But it's just kind of the proximity that Cuba is a really concerning thing. I don't know it's so much now, but in the 60s, when we had the big the semblance of the Cold War, it was a concern to a lot of people. Even in the absence of any formalized mechanics of cooperation, there's patterns that patterns of behavior that a country or a government can adopt that are noteworthy for kind of a non-conflictual approach. Altruism or charity. Maybe donating to something like Amnesty International. And I'm a child of the 80s, and I remember when the whole "We Are the World" thing came out, where a bunch of singers like Michael Jackson and Lionel Richie, and I'm really dating myself right now, came together and made an album to generate revenue to help people that are starving in Africa. I'm pretty sure if you go on YouTube, you could see the video and see the story about it. But like things like that kind of occur, and people give out of their own pocket for humanitarian aid. And I always really look in high regards to people that do that. People that might have extra money that they could donate to help some type of people in other countries that aren't as fortunate as us. I mean, yeah, are we risking that our funds may be corrupted or stuff like that? Obviously, but your heart's in the right place, and your intentions are well. There's also accommodations where we compromise. In a perfect world, we would all compromise and get along better. And then neutrality, maybe staying out of a conflict, much like the Switzerland. We always hear the Swiss government's always neutral. So that's another thing that's kind of interesting to take a look at. Um, States do not often formalize and coordinate their interactions through many mechanisms. We do have treaties, we have international laws, and we have international organizations. And we'll talk about some of those. But diplomacy is probably one of the more important things where, you have somebody that is skilled in talking to a person. I mean, I think if you would have asked me, right now I'm doing what I've always wanted to do. I always wanted to teach, right? But if you might have asked me maybe 20 years ago what, when I first started studying political science, what I wanted to do, it might have been some type of maybe diplomacy or policy making type issues. Probably not so much now because I learned a lot about it and I've dealt with public policy in a prior work that I used to do, and it's not as fulfilling as I originally thought it was going to be. But you have to have a skill to be able to negotiate and not get frustrated. The G8's a good example of diplomacy, and we'll talk about the G8 in a little bit. And, there's strategic face-to-face discussion between diplomats. We always hear administrations going across the world to meet with each other to discuss issues. And the top leaders will meet, usually the president or the vice president or maybe the secretary of state here in the United States will go and meet. Now we also have the ability to either Zoom or teleconference leaders, and you don't necessarily have to travel anymore. You can meet face-to-face on Zoom, which I think is pretty helpful. And then we have bilateral and multilateral agreements, which come through as, kind of setting up agreements between multiple countries in order for them to, prosper. And, we talk about the treaties. Here, we have semblance of NAFTA. Again, I personally live, I live in Chula Vista, so I live about 10 miles from the border. And, there's, and I live on the east side of Chula Vista, so, if I shoot down to 125, I can get to the Otay Mesa border, and that's where all the truck crossings are. You see a lot of semis going through NAFTA, which is a North American Free Trade Agreement that Bill Clinton put into place, and then Trump actually kind of revised it a bit. It was a treaty that tried to keep keep the flow of trade smoothly between the three North American countries, United States, Canada, and Mexico. One of the more famous ones is the European Union, and this is a multi-state, multi-purpose confederation based on treaties for cooperation among its 27 nations. The UK, I know, had their whole Brexit issue, and I know there was some concern about that. A lot of that European Union was developed through diplomacy and kind of the free flowing of people through the countries out there. I've never been to Europe, so I heard there's not that many hard borders there. And that was kind of one of the reasons that the UK decided to try to invoke the leaving of the European Union due to the concern of waves of immigration and the feeling that their trade economy wasn't really developing well. We also have international regimes. Again, that word is a little bit, I think, used incorrectly here, but we'll go through it. It's a multi-state agreement that signifies a set of laws and procedures, like the Kyoto Protocol, which was something that happened in Japan in the 2000s, where a lot of countries set climate agreements in it. The United States was not one of them, as W. They don't want the United States to be involved in the Kyoto Protocol. And there's also the World Trade Organization, which we talked about. We have alliances, right? Obviously, we're not going to go too in depth in that. We're allied with the UK and other countries throughout Europe, as well as Canada and Mexico in some instances. these are a list of the G8s and the G20s. So when you hear the word G8 summit or G20 summit, that's what they're talking about. We have international law. We have the International Court of Justice. Its main problem is that one or both disrupting countries often do not accept its jurisdiction. So, we have different types of law systems here in the United States. There are some, in the world. Sorry, check that, in the world. Natural laws, the universal principles of behavior that are recognized through human reason and human nature, and that direct us to act with goodness. And there's positivist law, which explicit written that define both appropriate and acceptable behaviors between states, right? And we have the International Court, a criminal court, which is set up by the UN. Transnationalism, where we have a system of institutions in which the key people, loyalties, and identities are not linked to any particular country, which I think is very hard to do. And then international organizations where, these are transnational institutional mechanisms whose objectives are to influence the behaviors of policy in states. So, the more these IGOs are really, really kind of, in the mainstream, like the EU, NATO, the IMF, the World Health Organization. Before that, we had the League of Nations, which became the UN. And then NATO, which we always hear about. The UN is an international organization directing to managing security of international actors. They have 5 principal departments in them, or 5 principal organs, as the author says. The UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, the Economic and Social Council, the Secretariat, and the International Court of Justice. It's a lot of it is with peacekeeping and improving health and welfare and human rights of people. It's interesting when you ask somebody what you think that are some examples of human rights violations, and sometimes people have different ideas of what you would consider a human rights violation. And a lot of it is the attempt to kind of improve relationships between governments. And kind of set in and act as, in a sense, sometimes a mediator. And if you look at this, you could see the different types of departments that are under the security and the Secretary and the General Assembly and the ICJ. And you can see there's a lot of programs that are out there that, in a sense, try to develop positive relations between countries. We have non-governmental organizations that are international. They provide information. They promote public policies. They provide services. Greenpeace, the World Wildlife Federation, Union of Concerned Scientists, and Amnesty International are examples of this. We also have multinational corporations, like Exxon, BP, which is British Petroleum, Samsung, Citigroup, Sony, just off the top of my head, Toyota, Disney. These are important to political economies, all right? And they kind of function as a way that we can develop a global network for product diversification, and not just that, maybe saving on merchandise. So when we go out and buy something that's not as expensive if it was made in the U.S., that's one of the weird things about our economy is, yes, we need to pay our workers more, but why would businesses pay their workers $15 an hour when they can go down to Mexico and pay them $5 an hour? So, kind of that moral dilemma that we have here. Can we have both, high income for our citizens as well as cheaper prices? It's a really, a conundrum that we have. So when cooperating interests of these governments are greater than the mutual interest, they are likely to act competitively than cooperatively. They play power politics. soft power, they influence through being admired, maybe, kind of that big brother or the big sister that you look up to, um, exchanging power, and also the concept of sanctions or putting on punishments on governmental bodies in the world. So we talk about competition across borders. One of the mechanisms is competition when soft power and exchange power do not resolve differences. You have a balance of power where there is a equality in the power resources that can be exercised by a set of competing interests. And these 6 elements are associated with kind of the political realist view in this chapter. So the balance of terror, right? And domination. So, using fear and dominating over a person or a group of people. And the concept of globalization. I mean, we really slipped into a globalized economy in a sense. And, we're not here to discuss whether that's right or wrong. We just kind of recognize that. I mean, you could have your opinions on that. But again, it's going to be something that is based off of your ideology. This classic notion of balance of power describes an approach for maintaining stability in the relationships among states, and explains that peace can be assured only by a balancing of contending states. And it holds that there will be periodic wars, periodic episodes of war and violence, and we'll look at that in the next chapter. So just a little bit more of kind of the balance of power, and a look at it. In these slides, it goes into the idea of a dominant system, hegemony, and it also kind of highlights mutually assured destruction, where you kind of can come to the realization that the United States and China may never get into any type of armed conflict because we do depend on each other so much. China holds a lot of our international debt, and they provide a lot of cheap labor for our businesses here. So, any type of conflict would not be beneficial to anybody. So that's what we can, kind of ascertain with mutually assured destruction. Also, with the advancement in technologies, if we get into some type of nuclear war, it's going to be over for both of us. So that's kind of also in the background, in their heads, where, if there's any type of grievances or problems that will come up. Here are the 6 key elements of the balance of power under a political realist perspective. So just take a look at it, and be cognizant of what some of this stuff is. And we all countries have nuclear weapons, and those are kind of used to, in a sense, kind of, I always like to kind of, make an analogy to football. I always believe, and this is my own personal opinion, I think the key to having a championship football team is having a great defense, right? And I think this is kind of one of the ideals that this might be relevant to. Russia, the United States, France, China have nuclear weapons. Supposedly North Korea, Iran do as well. But I always think, you need to arm yourself in case there is a conflict that might potentially happen. And if, we don't have diplomacy working out, there might be a problem. There might be a possibility that we have some type of conflict. Usually when there are governments that act outside of what they're supposed to be doing, they might face sanctions where you hold resources, whether it's money, whether it's aid. You can withhold it, and that might be a way to pressure them to comply without actually using violence. In the international relations system, it's a bipolar, multipolar, and unipolar thing. So the United States now dominates a hegemon in a unipolar system. Talked about mutually assured destruction and nuclear weapons. We'll go into political violence in a little bit. We also have, a kind of a history of colonialism where, kind of one bigger country coming in and taking another country over and exploiting things. You have segregation. The book talks about Portugal and Africa. Assimilationism, where it's an attempt to transform a colonial state into an external extension of the dominant state, like France, and then indirect rule, like Great Britain. We also have some aspects of neocolonialism, where it's characterized as official withdrawal from a dominant country or dominant government, but with domination maintained usually by economic leverage. So the patterns established under a dependency approach under colonialism evolved into a world system of dominance, dependence that is goal and systematic. One example is the DRC, or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which, you had key problems in the history of this country, where we had corruption, neocolonialism, political decay, poverty, and a lot of violence in that part of the world. Now, globalization is one of the things, like I said, that we're all not going to agree on, right? Some people say we should remain isolationist and produce all products here in the United States, and not, in a sense, maybe not trade. I guess that might be a little bit of extreme. Or, maybe let countries have reduced trade agreements and have trade free fully. I mean, it's all an individual perspective. There's really no right or wrong answer on it. So, 4 major domains of globalism is economic globalism, social and cultural globalism, military globalism, and environmental globalism. So, are globalization efforts positive or negative? Again, that's going to be your own individual opinion. I'm not going to try to influence you on that. They're both very legitimate arguments on both sides. And I know that might be a cop-out, but just kind of to put that into your head. Borders are more permeable to goods, people, capital, and ideas, especially hard borders. And when I say hard borders, I mean the fence line like we have down here in South San Diego. And there's questions as to whether states can sustain sufficient cooperation among everybody in such a competitive world that we live in. So there's 3 major trends in the post-Cold War international system. Military power is still significant, and we still see that. There's a lot more economic competition, and that could be intense and, maybe create some hard feelings between people that are allies, our countries that are allies. And then there's a state-centered approach where we evolve toward one in which transnational entities are very important. When you think about it, there's the yes and the no's about globalization. One of the big things is the lower prices, but then on the other end, there might be some human rights violations. So again, I'm not trying to influence you. Go ahead and take a look at this and maybe decide on your own what you think is better. And if you want to shoot me an email and tell me, I'll definitely have a conversation with you about it. This is one of the kind of the restrictions that we have with this whole COVID situation, where we're not meeting in class. And this is one of the good things that we could talk about if we were together as a class. Okay, so let's go ahead and go to the next chapter. And we're going to talk about political violence. So I know that section could be a little dry. Things are going to definitely pick up when we talk about political violence, because there's a lot of interesting things that come out of political violence. And whether or not we have domestic terrorism or international terrorism, it's a whole kind of set of beliefs that might differ among people. So here we're going to talk about political violence. We're going to relate the use of violence to the formation and maintenance of political society. We're going to classify the major types of political and non-political violence. We're going to talk about the nature and causes of war. Are we naturally inclined to wanting to get into war? Are we naturally prone to violence? That would be a John Hobbes type. I mean, not John Hobbes. I think John Locke. A Thomas Hobbes type belief. that we are naturally inclined to conflict. And then we'll evaluate kind of the normative explanations of political violence. So when we talk about violence, violence obviously is the use of physical force, usually by threats or actual actions. I think a threat can be just as effective as a physical altercation at times. Political violence is the actual physical violence or various serious threat of such violence to achieve political goals. And, you can look at January 6th. You can look at what happens in the Middle East. You can go all the way back to start of the world, the start of civilization, where we've always had people prone to getting into conflicts. So like I talked about Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes was a political philosopher who believed that the formation of a political society was an attempt to overcome the frequent reliance on force and violence in human interactions. Force becomes the final resort, not the first resort. So basically what Hobbes believes is that if you are a ruler, you need a kind of a big stick, so to speak, to, kind of borrowing the Teddy Roosevelt quote, to keep people in line. And at the very last, intimidation is a very good tool. Actually, I was in Las Vegas one time, and I was walking in a casino, and I saw a guy named Brock Lesnar. And I don't know if he is Google. If you don't know who he is, Google him. He was a UFC fighter, and that guy is huge and he's intimidating. And if he would have told me to go buy him a drink, I probably would have. Something as simplistic as that. But then we also have state violence against individuals, and state violence against groups. Order maintaining activity, typical and supported. We have establishment violence. We obviously need law enforcement, kind of going to that first point, and military to keep people in line, because I think people are inclined to maybe act out of what societal norms are and use threats and violence to get what they want. Obviously, we all know that, right? So things like the military and law enforcement are necessary to maintain order in a civilized society. A lot of people talk about, disbanding the police or abolishing the police. I don't think personally that's the answer. I think it goes deeper than that. This is not a sociology class, so I'm not going to really go into depth about it. But I basically think that, we need a dialogue between all communities to come together and ensure kind of a trust. That's my little spiel there. War, violence between countries, violence between governments. Terrorism, where an individual or group commits violence against a group of individuals or another state, country. And then Rummel in 2008 found that deaths by government establishment violence far outweigh deaths from war. So some of the things that we have here, instruments of state power against the state's enemies. We have the judicial system here, which kind of ties into with prisons. So if we act out of what societal norms are, then we could be put into prison, have our liberty taken away. Pretty simple. The military is used to protect, and internal security forces like police or FBI or customs are all, their roles are to protect us against state enemies, and also people that are within our state that might be enemies, where we have domestic terrorism or domestic incidents. Here's a little chart of where some of these types of political violence falls. So we have individual violence against an individual, so things like crime. We have individual political violence where there's assassination, or if we go back to the 1880s, duels. I was just telling a student asked me for a recommendation of a Western, and I don't really know a lot about Westerns, but one of my favorite ones is Tombstone. So there's a duel in that. Pretty cool, right? Usually it doesn't happen anymore, unless it's in the movies or whatever. Then we have group violence against an individual, assassination on the behalf of a group, terrorism, whether it's domestic, international, or where a country sponsors terrorism, which we've seen in the past. And terrorism is a revolutionary strategy where we have usually a violence by small organized cell of political activists. One of the key issues is class in an act of terrorism can be whether the victims are non-combatants. So I think the simple definition of terrorism is trying to intimidate somebody, a person or a group of people or a government by the threat of force or actually using force, whether or not that organization is outside the state or within the state. Some things there. We also have nation-based violence. You might have inside a country aspects of genocide, whether it's Pol Pot in the 70s or Milosevic in the 90s. Syria recently, where there's been accusations, and even what's going on in Chechnya also during in the past, where groups of political violence results in the murder of many members of one ethnic group. So, we have this establishment violence against a group of people that are being wiped out, so to speak. There's also class conflict. Socioeconomic conditions might be attributed to, class conflict. What was it? The whole eat the rich or tax the rich or whatever. And I don't even think we need to go outside of our country to take a look where we do have conflicts. While they might necessarily be violent, we do have kind of conflicts against classes here in the United States. In other countries, it might be a little bit more violent, but here, more of a war of words than anything else. Some charts. Then we have individual groups violence against the states, which are riots, which we see a lot. Rebellions, the Rebel Alliance tried to separate from the Imperials, Star Wars reference, sorry, where these are more frequent, premeditated, organized, and widespread violence. We all know what happened in 1776 here in the United States, so that is a pretty familiar term for a lot of us. In Civil War, we got to jump up almost a little less than 100 years later, where we saw Civil War happen, where political violence can happen when a significant portion of the population and region actively supports a movement, and political violence emerges on a large scale. So, the whole North versus South thing here in the United States. So these are two really good examples that we can tie in. We could actually look at each of these and come up with real world scenarios that have actually happened here in the United States. So I think this is good. We also have separatist violence, where it's to achieve substantial political autonomy from the existing political system. A coup, where a top leader or part of a leadership group is replaced by violent means or the threat of violence. Revolution, which we talked about, the goal of the revolution is to replace the existing political system. Hitler ascended into Germany, and the fall of communism in East Germany are both examples of democratic revolutions. So we also have stages of revolution where we have selective acts of war, terrorism, usually well organized, revolutions from above where political elites and urban centers will push for a revolution. Guerrilla warfare, where a long protracted campaign of political violence against the state from a rural basis. Kind of the old, again, using the Star Wars analogy. If you've seen the movie Rogue One, the scene when they're in the Imperial City and those freedom fighters come out and start killing the Imperials, that's a good example of guerrilla warfare. You don't know who is the enemy and who's not. Usually not organized, shooting from different angles. Basically, I don't need to explain it to you all. Democratic revolution, where we usually have legal, generally non-violent political action. And kind of belief on what are some of the conditions and theories that play into the rising expectations of a revolution in the J curve theory. So basically, what the J curve theory says is James Davies, who is a sociologist in 1962, introduced a belief that persistent economic growth and advance led to the development of psychological expectations things will continue to improve. So we have a view that our values are going to get better, or our situation is get better, and if it doesn't, then we are probably slipping into aspects of a revolution, right? So the belief between the fact that we expect things to get better but they don't, that might motivate somebody to take action. So it's a really interesting theory when you take a look at it and you think about it. And even though it's from the 70s, a little bit dated, it's still kind of an interesting way to look at this. So what conditions do we have associated with countries in which revolutions occur? Usually there's going to be conflicting elites with different agendas, different ethnic groups dividing each other, a rapid economic growth or a decline in prosperity, a short history as an autonomous state, right? Divisive intervention by international systems, governments, actors, whatever you want to call them, rapid population growth, and social mobilization. So a lot of these will lead to things that might cause a revolution, and one of the things is obviously is decline in prosperity. If people get desperate, they might act out. And I think we can maybe also look at maybe international assistance pressuring a country to act a certain way where the people might not want to. Well, it's an interesting thing to look at when we reflect back in history and kind of look at some of the revolutions and what caused them. So where we have force between states, we have blockades. Remember I talked earlier about Cuba and the blockade that happened right before the Cuban Missile Crisis, or during the Cuban Missile Crisis. State-sponsored terrorism, maybe a brief single use of force or a clash, a low-intensity conflict, and war, which we all kind of know about, right? And, when does war occur? Usually when newer nations are formed, they're most likely to initiate war. More likely in states that would effectively socialize a citizen to accept the government's action on national security, and starts with rising prosperity but relatively poor people. One of the interesting points about this is the belief that countries with market economies are as likely to participate in war as those with command economies. So it's an interesting take and maybe a stereotype that might kind of be dispelled a bit. Countries with desirable geopolitical factors are more likely to go to war. Also, governments that are more highly militarized, and countries with more nationalistic political cultures are more warlike. So kind of a really simple, understandable way that the author puts it there. There's a theory that war between the most powerful countries are highly unlikely, like I talked about, that mutually assured destruction. Diplomacy seems to work here with the United States, other countries. But democracy has spread to a lot of major countries here in the world, and established democracies rarely get into disagreements or fights. Let me strike the word disagreements, really get into violent conflicts with each other. Well, obviously I have disagreements, but I just wanted to kind of reiterate that I mean violent disagreements. Globalization has also increased countries' economic dependence on each other, which we talked about. And transnational organizations have become more significant and more powerful, which we looked at in chapter 11. But what causes war? Scarcity in natural resources, right? inadequacy of institutions, maybe not a fully developed education system, or maybe not social welfare programs for people, maybe not helping people. And in human nature, some people believe that we're naturally inclined to war. Again, I'm not a brain psychologist by any means. So I mean, it's are we naturally prone to violence as humans? I don't know. I mean, that's a really good question, and I'm not really qualified to answer that. Here are the list of the most dispute-prone countries versus the least peaceful countries versus the most peaceful countries. So interesting take. So when we talk about political violence must be understood as a failure of institutionalized political action, or maybe the falling of diplomacy, or the failing of talking to each other. Conservative ideology, like on the right, provides the strongest condemnation of such violence. And another perspective, political violence is the best, sometimes the only mechanism for liberation from oppression and tyranny. And this is what we kind of can reflect back on in, maybe the Revolutionary War that we had here in the United States. There's really no good answer when political violence is justified, much like with anything. In political science, there are two sides to every issue. So it's really interesting thing to take a look at. When is violence justifiable? That's always a good one. Self-defense. Obviously, I have very much a belief in that. Is political violence unacceptable under every possible circumstance? If no, can an outcome emerge from the use of political violence that is so preferable to the existing situation that political violence seems justifiable? Some really good questions here. Okay, everybody, that is chapters 11 and 12. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.